Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see you all, albeit virtually. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Debbie Abrahams. I'm the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth, and I'm also the co-chair with Baroness Saida Varsi of the all-party group for Compassion in Politics. Now, if you don't know anything about Compassion in Politics, please do go to the website. And what we're trying to do with this all-party group is introduce a different approach to politics, a kinder approach to politics, so we have compassion at the heart of decision-making instead of the adversarial process that we currently have. Now, today we are going to look at how we build well-being into the heart of the recovery, and I think we really have a unique opportunity with the tragedy around the COVID pandemic. There is also, as I say, an opportunity. We've seen today in the Prime Minister's speech a lot of positive ideas coming through, but there's also the reality that tomorrow we will have social security claimants who will be required to go into the job centre and who will be sanctioned if they don't undertake job searches. So there's the imbalance currently in terms of what is being promised and what is actually happening. So we need to try and see how we can influence that, whether it's looking at inequalities, homelessness, or elsewhere. And we've got a fantastic panel here to help us. I should also mention what we're trying to do with some of these ideas is to incorporate them into what we're calling the COVID Legacy Bill. So we hope to introduce this at some stage over the next few months. And as I say, we have a fantastic panel to help us look at what a recovery which has well-being at the heart of it might look like. So if I do a very brief introduction, we have Dr. Daisy Fancourt, who is the Associate Professor of Psychobiology and Epidemiology at UCL. And Daisy is going to present the very latest findings from UCL's COVID social study. We have Lord Richard Layard, who is Programme Director at the Centre of Economic Performance at the LSE. Now, he was one of the first economists to work on happiness, and many of you will remember the work that he published back in 2005 about happiness and the evidence from a new science. Louise Aston is Wellbeing Director at the Business in the Community, and we'll look forward to hearing what Louise has to say again about how we can build well-being into a healthy recovery. And Dawn Austwick is the CEO of the National Lottery Community Fund, the body responsible for distributing funds raised by the National Lottery for Good Causes. And finally, we have Professor Michael Marmot. Michael is the Professor of Epidemiology at UCL, but is also the Director of the Institute of Health Equity, a former president of the World Medical Association. I can remember when I worked as a public health consultant, how important the work that Michael did, going back to the Whitehall studies, Michael. So now you know how old I am. But the work that Michael did on the Marmot Review and Fair Society Healthy Lives publication that resulted from that, and more recently, the 10-year review that was published in February. If you haven't seen that, please do. We're actually getting worse. So the importance of what we need to do around that cannot be underestimated. So each of the panelists is going to speak for around 7 minutes, and then we have the opportunity for questions and answers. So I hope to finish by 20 to 5 at the latest. So hold on to your questions, pop them in the chat bar, which is the function that you can find under all the pictures of us all. Do use the chat bar as well as an opportunity to introduce yourselves to other people in the panel. Everybody will be on mute until they do speak. We look forward to hearing from you. So I'm going to start with Daisy and hand over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Can I just check that everybody can hear me okay and see my slide okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. I'm going to be giving a whistle-stop tour about what has happened to mental health across the 3 months since lockdown came in. And this study is being carried out at UCL. It's called the COVID-19 Social Study. And we mobilized a few days before lockdown started. And since then, we've gathered data from over 72,000 people across the UK. This is included for those who joined early because it's a weekly study. They've now been taking part for up to 15 weeks of data collection. So that means that across the 102 days that we've had since lockdown began, we've had over 500,000 surveys completed, an average of 3,000 to 6,000 every single day. The sample is very diverse and it's weighted to population proportions, and we're analysing the data in real time. So we've already had over 30 reports and scientific papers from this study. So I'm going to be sharing with you what we've learned so far. So my first question has been, how has mental health been affected during COVID-19? Now, if we look at the lead up to lockdown, a number of studies have now shown us that mental health got worse across this period. So particularly in the uncertainty before lockdown came in, it seems that happiness decreased and things like fear, stress and sadness increased. And several papers have now come out showing that by the start of lockdown, levels of mental illness in the UK were already substantially higher than normal. Now, since this lockdown, we've been able to plot day by day what's happened to these different measures. So as you can see, lockdown is shown on these graphs, just on the left-hand side on the 23rd of March. And since then, levels of depression initially stayed relatively stable, but have since started to decrease, especially since the easing of lockdown has started to come in. Anxiety, though, has decreased quite steadily across this lockdown period, and life satisfaction has been going up. However, this is, of course, changes from these worse states that people found themselves in at the start of lockdown. And in fact, we found that around 35% of adults are saying that their mental health has been worse in the last 3 months compared to usual. So whilst we're seeing some improvement back towards normal levels, we don't seem to have reached those normal levels even now. But a big question is everybody being equally affected by this? And the simple answer is no. If we stratify these results by age, we find that younger adults, who are shown here in the pale blue lines, they've been worse consistently across every single measure of mental health across lockdown, whereas adults over the age of 60 seem to have had better mental health across this period. Similarly, if we stratify by household income, we see there's been a social gradient across these experiences too. People in households with lower household income have performed worse across every single mental health measure consistently. The pattern's the same when we look at mental illness. People who had a diagnosed mental illness before the lockdown came in have experienced worse levels of mental health. Now, this might to a certain extent be expected, but it's interesting to see that these differences have stayed or even widened across this period, across these different measures. And finally, when we look at ethnicity, this time weekly as opposed to daily, so we've got sufficient statistical power, we find that people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds have again had poorer experiences across every aspect of mental health. So the main thing to take away from this is that whilst mental health has been showing some improvements across this time, these still don't seem to be back to normal levels, and people have not been equally affected by this. A big question that is relevant to mental health is loneliness and how people have been socially affected by what's been going on. We compared data from Understanding Society, which is a representative panel study of adults in the UK, which used the same loneliness measures that we used in our COVID social study. So we looked at data in the 2 years prior to COVID compared to data during COVID. And what we found is that many more people are reporting being lonely during COVID pandemic compared to normal. So whereas on average around 8% of people usually say they often feel lonely, this has been more like 18% during lockdown. When we look at who's actually been most at risk for loneliness, we found there are certain factors that are often risk factors for loneliness that have continued to be risk factors. So for example, if we look at age, we find that younger adults on the left-hand side in blue are often more at risk of loneliness, but this has actually been found to be exacerbated during the COVID lockdown. So age has been even more of a risk factor than usual. And we see this as well for income and for people living alone. So in other words, those people who are most at risk are the ones that we might expect, but unfortunately they're even more at risk than usual. The thing that's even more concerning about loneliness is there hadn't really been any improvement over the lockdown period. So we know it's worse than normal, but it doesn't seem to be getting much better at all, with only tiny changes in the last couple of weeks. And again, we're seeing that it's worse consistently across lots of different groups. Another big issue has been adversities that have been experienced because of the pandemic, not just catching the virus, but the other kinds of psychological and social effects that the virus can have for people. When we look at worries about things, then we can see that most stresses have improved. For example, worries about catching COVID, having access to food, and finances have decreased across the last 14 weeks. But unfortunately, we see this social gradient again. So people with lower household income have been more worried about all of these factors. And the truth is they have more reason to be worried about them because unfortunately, they've been more likely to experience all of these adversities too. So people who've got lower levels of socioeconomic position, shown here in red, have been 1.5 to 2 times more likely to have lost their jobs. They've been 4 to 5 times more likely to be unable to access sufficient food in the early weeks of lockdown when there was the rush on supermarkets. And they've been between 7 and 9 times more likely to be unable to pay their bills. The story gets even worse, I'm afraid, because when we look at the relationship between these adversities and mental health, we find that people of lower socioeconomic position are actually having a closer relationship between adversities and mental health. So in other words, they're more likely to worry about these adversities, then they're more likely to experience them, and this is likely to have an even greater toll on their anxiety and depression than people with more socioeconomic resources. So finally, we've had some newspaper articles and stories that have suggested that some people have actually been loving lockdown, and this might seem at odds with what I just presented. So we looked into this last week. It actually turns out only 4% of people have been very much enjoying lockdown, and there are 4 times as many who've been enjoying it not at all. The vast majority of this has not been a particularly pleasant experience. And when we break this down by lots of the factors I've already mentioned, we find that those people who've been enjoying it the most have, unsurprisingly, been between the ages of 30 and 60, living with others with a higher household income and with no previous mental illness. In other words, they're the group who've been having arguably the lowest risk factors for adverse experiences during this period. So in final messages, mental health and loneliness appear worse than normal during this pandemic. And unfortunately, the pandemic is not affecting everyone equally. Younger adults, people from low-income households, people with mental illness, and people from ethnic minority backgrounds are disproportionately at risk. And there's also a clear social gradient in adverse experiences and the psychological responses to these experiences. A point I wanted to pull out from a policy perspective is that we're actually seeing the same relationship between worrying about adverse experiences as the actual experience of these experiences and mental health. So it's not enough just to think that some issues might not actually happen for a while, like losing work. People worrying about this in the meantime is equally bad for their mental health as when it actually happens to them. But finally, I just want to address why I think looking at mental health is so important during the pandemic. There's obviously the clear issue that if we understand mental health, we can provide better support and guidance to people. But there's also the issue here that mental health is fundamentally linked in with compliance. We've been seeing in our study that people's compliance with the guidelines to prevent the spread of COVID has been gradually declining. Majority compliance, so sticking generally to the rules, is still pretty high, but complete compliance has really gone down. It's down to around 20% in adults under the age of 30. And what we're finding is that mental health is very much linked in with whether or not people are complying with the guidelines. So in other words, if we actually want to stop the spread of this virus, it's fundamental that we address mental health as well, so that people are more likely to comply with the rules. As a final note, we know it's also important to be comparing our findings with other studies from other countries so we get a really rich understanding of this. The COVID Minds network is a network that I direct, which the Wellcome Trust is funding, where we're actually linked up with over 100 other longitudinal studies around the world, and we're looking at comparing these findings cross-nationally. If people are interested in seeing what these studies in other countries are, then our website is covidminds.org. And if you're interested in seeing any of the results that I presented here in more detail, on our website, covidsocialstudy.org, you can see all of the reports from the last 15 weeks and all of our papers in preprint or published form. And we also send out a regular newsletter as we have new updates on findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daisy. That was, you set a very, very high bar for everybody to follow. And I'm starting to see the questions coming in, so do keep putting them in the chat bar so that we can follow up later. I'm going to hand over now to Layard. Richard.
Can you hear me? Hello, everybody. That was, of course, a very sad tale for some people, for probably most people. What I want to talk about is the silver lining, because I do think that in 3 ways, the experience of COVID does open up the possibility of a better country in a better society after the end of COVID than we had when we went into it. So I'll call them cultural, mental, and political. Cultural, we obviously want a society in which people feel a strong sense of community and obligation to each other. That's what produces a high level of well-being. And I think that we have seen in COVID a greater sense of social solidarity. People feeling more fellow feeling for each other because they are all going through the same a battle against the same enemy, if you like. But the idea of the common good, which has been rather thin in our country recently, has, I think, come much more to the fore in the form of COVID. And we need, of course, to think of all kinds of common goods and the way in which we can promote them by social solidarity. So I think that's a potential, but how are we going to lock in this feeling? I think it's down to every organization that exists, as the political parties. In business, we want much more sense of the solidarity of purpose within businesses, the common purpose of the workforce. And of course, we need it in the community as a whole. Voluntary organizations have a big role to play. I'm involved with Action for Happiness, whose members pledged to try and create as much happiness in the world as they can. This is the cultural change that we need to see. Moving on to mental, I think all of us have had to spend a bit more time managing our inner mental life than we used to, because there's less hustle and bustle. And it's also become very tough for some people, and they've really struggled to maintain their equilibrium. So people, I think, have become aware in themselves of the importance of mental health and the maintenance of their mental health. We've seen, of course, a big surge in the demand for support online for mental health problems. Again, Action for Happiness has been putting out a coping course, 50,000 people taking it. And this has been the case with all these voluntary organizations and statutory ones that are trying to support mental health. But I do think the NHS mental health services really deserve a big push in the years after COVID, because it's become so critical that this is the importance of this to people's lives. So it's about 20 years since mental health became one of the top 3 priorities of the NHS. And yet the fraction of NHS expenditure going on mental health has not increased at all. It's time that changed. So the APPG on wellbeing economics proposed that the mental health expenditure should rise in real terms, twice as fast as on physical health. I think that is crucial for the next spending round. We've seen the IAPT program for psychological therapies below its target. We've got child psychological therapy services that were to have been developed going incredibly slowly. This has to change, which brings me to the third point, political. Things have changed in ways that we never thought things could possibly change. I mean, we've got a deficit that we would never have ever considered in previous years. So the change we want to see is that the goal of the government should become the well-being of the people. That's what we want. We want parties to subscribe to it and the government. We've got the methodology for doing it, and a group of us did apply this methodology to when we should come out of the lockdown, which I think had some influence on how people, and particularly in government, think about balancing all the conflicting claims involved in that decision. The Green Book allows now for well-being to become the integrative principle for public policy. The What Works Centre for Wellbeing has done a great job spreading information and knowledge about how to make that form of analysis. And the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Wellbeing Economics has produced a good report last year on how a spending review would look if it was aimed at the well-being of the people rather than whatever it is currently aimed at. And of course, the key priority is the social infrastructure, not the physical infrastructure. And my heart sinks when I hear that this build, build, build is the way to move our society forward. What we have to do is to build our social infrastructure, our mental health services, the well-being of our school children, the further education system giving skills, obviously the health service, but also social care. These have been so hardly treated in recent years, as well as community services, youth services, old people services, youth, children's services. It is critical that should be recognised as making much more difference, as the evidence shows, to human well-being than whether we can get faster from London to Birmingham. So let's have all our political parties pledged to make well-being the centrepiece of their policy formation. The statement I love is Thomas Jefferson: the life and happiness of the people is the only legitimate objective of good government. I completely agree with that. Let's have every party in the country subscribing to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was really provocative and very, very timely, given the Prime Minister's speech this afternoon as well. So thank you for that. And now I'm going to hand over to Louise Aston. Louise.
Thank you. So I'm coming from the perspective in terms of what role can business play in supporting public health and wellbeing. So for those of you who don't know who Business in the Community are, we're the oldest and largest business-led membership organisation dedicated to responsible business. So I think it's fair to say wellbeing has already been established as a key strand of responsible business and has been absolutely central to what Business in the Community has been doing for many years. So wellbeing is absolutely firmly established as a key strand of responsible business, and businesses haven't waited for government to tell them to put well-being at the heart of what they do. They've gone and done it anyway because it's the right thing to do and makes good business sense. So at the heart of what Business in the Community does is our responsible business map. It's our kind of Bible. It's central to what we're about, and it's aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Business Goals, which obviously include health and well-being. So we have a responsible business tracker, which is a measurement tool for businesses to track their progress against the responsible business map. And the 2019-2020 Responsible Business Tracker Insights report summarizes the key findings and best practice examples for the last tracker cycle and what that could mean in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the findings show that now, more than ever, being a responsible business really matters. The support companies offer to their employees, communities, and the most vulnerable during the pandemic speaks volumes. We believe that those who act responsibly now will be best prepared to handle what emerges on the other side of the crisis. It's also becoming clear that how issues are prioritised now will shape the new world. So even before COVID, we've seen that basically through the tracker assessment cycle, that what health and well-being actually continues to be the most material issue for companies. So again, you know, we've heard a lot about COVID acting as a catalyst for what was already latent demand that was already there. So in terms of thinking about actually creating an impactful wellbeing strategy is very much relies on taking a proactive, whole person, whole organisation approach to embedding wellbeing into organisational culture. So at Business in the Community, our Work Well model has been central to our campaigning on health and well-being for the past decade. So the model provides an evidence-based framework for taking a proactive whole person, whole system integrated approach to embedding health and well-being into organisational culture. And that in turn will result in thriving people, thriving business and thriving communities. So organisational well-being starts with leadership, and the model promotes physical and mental health and well-being as strategic boardroom issues aligned to achieving long-term sustainability. So many of our members, including companies like Anglian Water, Costain, Unipart, Santander, National Grid and Heathrow, support the well-being of their employees by taking this holistic, integrated and inclusive approach to ensuring that everyone's physical, mental, social and financial health is the best it can be. They recognise that their ability to perform successfully as businesses is entirely linked to the performance of their people. They all have a fundamental belief that looking after the well-being of their people is the right thing to do, and it makes them more successful commercially. They know that if people are at their best, then their business is at its best. And the evidence is growing that improving well-being not only helps reduce the cost of ill health, but also boosts engaged and healthy people, productivity, customer satisfaction and sales, increased stakeholder value, connected communities and sustainable business. There is a worry that as we move on from the worst of the pandemic, some people will see well-being as a luxury for the good times, something that can be deprioritized when the going gets tough. We know through the experience of the financial crisis a decade ago that the opposite is true. So far-sighted companies maintained and even increased their investment in well-being because they saw that the business benefits would be essential if they were to prosper in the recovery period. And the same is being seen during the pandemic. So many companies have increased their focus on well-being, and they are the ones that are likely to do well through the months and years to come. So momentum is growing in this area, and what we have seen is a diffusion of good practice as execs and non-execs have moved around companies. So far, it's mainly large companies that have embraced this agenda, and the challenge is to penetrate the SME market. So we know smaller companies can't generate the data to show a return on investment for what they might do, and because that's not the way they operate. We have to focus on the narrative of what good work and good management looks like and keep any interventions as affordable as possible. We know that creating good work is part of the solution in terms of tackling the systemic root causes of poor mental health, and conversely, creating good work that enhances physical and mental health. So employers can do more to relieve that pressure by taking ownership of creating good work that enhances good work for everyone. We know large companies can and do cascade good practice through their supply chains, and this has worked particularly well in some sectors like construction, where suppliers are largely local. But we know it's harder in other sectors where supply chains are global and often remote. So lastly is, what do businesses need from government to support public health and well-being? So why is it that company-funded health and well-being services are often classed as taxable benefits when they're actually saving the NHS money and boosting productivity for the economy? Why is it that millions of people working as contractors or freelancers are denied access to even basic support services like company EAPs because of fears they will fall foul of IR35? Setting aside the moralities, does the potential gain in national insurance contributions really outweigh the cost of avoidable ill health to the NHS, the DWP and social services? In this country, we have world-beating companies that are trailblazers for putting well-being at the heart of what they do. we should be celebrating them and removing the barriers that prevent other UK companies from joining the movement. Also, with a small amount of investment, the government should update the HSE management standards and bring them up to date. There could also be the opportunity to relaunch them with a new national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, as a set of voluntary guidelines in promoting mental health and preventing psychological harm at work, as pioneered by Canada. They would send out a really strong message that physical and mental health need to be positioned on a parity of esteem. We know what gets measured gets managed, and we know that there's a strong interest from the investment community in public disclosure for both leading and lagging wellbeing indicators that are indicative of future performance. And one of the enhanced standards from the Stevenson Farmer Review, Thriving at Work, outlines a series of enhanced standards for employers who can and should do more to lead the way. The report recommends that these employers should increase transparency and accountability through internal and external reporting. And also, in terms of attracting the best talent, we know that 80% of young people would trade their salary to work for a company that prioritises well-being. So in summary, in the UK, I think we've reached a tipping point for well-being that has the potential to really take off if we're bullish about accelerating this agenda. The implications of doing nothing will result in going out of business, and we need to do more to celebrate the world-beating initiatives of many UK companies. We need to move faster and further if more people knew about good practice and spread the message.
Thank you, Louise. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Finally, penultimately, over to Dawn Austwick. Lovely to see you, Dawn.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to be here. I'm going to look at that from a community perspective and really share some observations from the funding that we've been doing over the last 3.5 odd months. I wanted to talk about sort of 4 areas really: adaptability, technology, place, and the kind of ecosystem, and then just round up with some thoughts about where now. First point, adaptability. I think if we look at the response from the community to COVID-19, we cannot but be impressed with the speed and the accuracy with which communities have organised themselves, largely in the absence of planning, and out with the technocratic process that we all live in. So let's have a little think about that. What's also interesting, I think, in community responses, often the responses end up being multi-purpose. So you might think they're about food, but actually they're about loneliness. I'm very conscious of some teachers locally who had been delivering food parcels to vulnerable youngsters who should have been in school but weren't. And what they were doing there was, yes, they were making sure they got meals, but they were also making sure that they were okay and their family circumstances were okay. You see restaurateurs who've completely reconfigured their business model to work with a community group to get food out. Veterans food organisations that generally bring people together to eat, actually just delivering food. Asian Women's Centre, very obvious one, producing fusion food and completely changing the way in which they operate. Similarly, around kit, the sort of absence of digital equipment for large swathes of people who really need it has been addressed by communities just getting neighbours to collect their redundant bits of kit, or what they thought were redundant, experts reconfiguring them and getting them out. Similarly, complete redesign of services around loneliness with things like peer mentoring, huge numbers of volunteers offering to operate online and locally, and local charities having to reconfigure the way in which they operate those services. Jambo Radio in Glasgow, a multilingual African radio service that's gone from streaming music to streaming advice and help for those particular community groups. And I think what I would observe around all of this is that we've talked a little bit, or Daisy certainly talked about the disproportionate impact on certain communities. I think there's also an interesting question about actually whether there's been a disproportionately positive response from certain communities, and whether we've really tracked that. And I would notably talk about a number of those are under the radar, not the radio. They might be unincorporated groups, they might be your street, they might be a faith group, but they probably don't fit into any category. I think funders have also been adaptable. We managed to get 120 million quid's worth of cash out in the first 6 weeks of the emergency, and we completely reconfigured our entire funding programmes for the first 6 months of this financial year. And we weren't alone in working that fast. So it's interesting how much you can do when you really put your mind to it and how quickly you do it. Technology, well, is technology an enabler or has it been a disabler? It's obviously been a bit of both. I've talked about how many services have moved online, and this isn't just major national charities and community networks going online, it's small little organisations. A great example, Sunbeams Cumbria provides music therapy for kids. Now it's providing specialist music streaming to disabled people across Cumbria. Hope in Community in Bury doing a very similar thing with its peer support services. I think what we see is that technology has transformed the way in which some services are being delivered and transformed future opportunity, but it won't all be about staying exactly as it is. Flip side of the kind of digital bit is data. I think generally the data response has been pretty poor. I think communities, charities, the social infrastructure sector is behind on really having great data. Final interesting issue on data, there's a sort of assumption that if you've got no technology in your organisation, you're no good in some way. Either you're a bit dodgy or suspicious, or you're just a bit incompetent. I think we should challenge that assumption. Lots of little organisations, they don't need technology to do what they do. So technology can enable, but it isn't an answer. And I think as we make some quite big choices moving forward, we have to think about what are the values that drive those choices rather than the technology that drives them. So in other words, we utilise the technology for social purpose. Place. One observation, the unit of identification is very, very local. My parents live in a village of 200. For me in lockdown, my unit of identification has been my street and my park. I think most people would say something pretty similar. Definitely a rebirth of neighbourliness. I mean, I'm sure all of you have been involved in mutual aid groups and your street coming out and all the rest of it. And it's not just been about sort of food parcels and so on. It's also about improving your neighbourhood. It's about neighbourhood watches coming together and putting up hanging baskets and so on. Second point around place, many of us have been working from home. This will redefine our cities and our places of work. It will redefine how we think about public space. It'll redefine how we think about our home, what we want our city centres to be, and how we use them to bring people together in ways that we probably won't have done before because they won't all be coming to the office anymore, etc. The ecosystem. My real question here is, where does value get added and by whom and how? And is that overarching ecosystem right from national down to those street-based groups, is it more than the sum of the parts? And I would observe there's a lot of tensions. There's an interesting sort of juxtaposition between local action that's just got on with it and a sort of national desire to coordinate or to oversee or to gather data or even possibly to control. There was a wonderful moment in the response where there was a sort of conversation about volunteers and how wouldn't it be marvellous if we had a national database of all the volunteers so that if there was a shortage of volunteers in East Hartlepool, we could tell West Hartlepool and then they could find some. But of course, what actually happens on the ground is the people who live in East Hartlepool talk to the people in West Hartlepool and they don't need to go through that convoluted process. Charities have faced, I think, the same tension between local branches, local activity and big national programmes. We see it, we get a lot of applications in from local branches of national charities, often very customised what they're looking for. And there's a tension between what the expertise at the centre is finding and analysing, saying is a priority, and what those local branches are saying. Similarly with standards, I was really interested in one of the immediate responses I heard from the sort of what you might call the highly professionalised end of the sector around all these glorious volunteers who wanted to go and talk to the old lady next door or down the street. Well, they haven't been trained in safeguarding. We can't let them do, we can't let all these people go off and do that. Of course, those are really genuine points, but actually, what about the entrepreneurial spirit and the spirit of generosity that just wants to get on with it? And I think there's a real tension between the desire to be tidy and the human desire to do things that are messy. And how do you calibrate between the two? So just to sort of come through to sort of final thoughts, there are opportunities, I think, to do things differently. I would really observe that there has been a lot of what we would call generous leadership in this emergency, people working collaboratively, whether that's horizontally across charitable sectors, whether that's vertically between the national and the local. I think infrastructure bodies have really risen to the challenge of thinking about what they're there for. How do they add value? How do they help that little community organisation? I think funders have got better actually at sharing data and thinking about how they can be complementary. I do wonder if we need to think a little bit about, given the funding constraints that we already see, the reduction in income that charities have faced and the increase in demand, how is that ecosystem going to work effectively in the future? And how can you do more on less? And I think that really plays to some of the stuff that has been happening locally, where actually they haven't needed a lot of money to get an awful lot done. Final couple of thoughts. I would observe that I think the mainstream struggles to cope with systems that don't look like it. So communities that operate, for example, on a cash basis, communities that don't operate digitally, communities that are not interested in scale or replication, communities that are not incorporated or even organisations, communities that are not driven by money. Our structures and our systems really can't quite cope with people who work to, or organisations or other systems and processes that work to a different agenda. Which kind of brings me to my last question, which I think is really interesting. Somewhere in my briefing, someone said, how can communities be harnessed to better effect? And I was thinking, well, that's really interesting because that assumes that communities are here as an instrument of something else. Whereas I think we ought to think about whether communities actually have an intrinsic value of their own right in actually being a part of the human condition. Part of what creates well-being in people is belonging to a community, and people make lots of choices about what sort of communities and to what extent. And it comes back to my point about systems, really. I think we tend to think about communities and people as being cogs in systems that are designed by centres. I think we should be moving to be thinking about how do those systems become cogs in people's lives that then support and enable people to live good and better lives. And that is about systems being people-led, strengths-based, and fundamentally about human relationships.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dawn. I'm going to move swiftly on to Michael. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. People have said that with the pandemic, they've had to get used to the idea of what exponential growth looks like. Apparently, there's been exponential growth in the sales of Albert Camus' The Plague that have roughly paralleled the rise in the COVID cases. And Camus said, the pestilence is at once blight and revelation. It brings the hidden truth of a corrupt world to the surface. Maybe corrupt world is too strong, but my view of the pandemic is that it exposes the inequalities in society and amplifies them. And as you said, Debbie, in February, I published the Marmot review 10 years on. And the fundamental idea, and it's not very different to Richard Layard's fundamental truth, which is that health tells us something very important about the nature of society, and health inequalities tell us something very important about inequalities in society. So I documented in my 10 years on review, that life expectancy had more or less stopped improving. Health inequalities continued to get bigger, and life expectancy for women in the poorest 10% of areas outside London actually declined. Wow, that's appalling. Health stopped improving, health inequalities got bigger, and life expectancy for the poorest women outside London got worse. If you agree with my general proposition that health and health inequalities are telling us something fundamental about the nature of society, the nature of society stopped improving and inequalities in society got bigger. And then COVID-19 comes along and exaggerates all of that in an utterly predictable way. We know that the impact of lockdown has exaggerated inequalities, that people, key workers, have to go out to work or lose their jobs. I saw figures today, both from the UK and the US, that the effect of lockdown has been to shift wealth upwards. Richer households can't spend all that money that they used to spend on luxuries and enjoyment, so their wealth has increased. And because they're not spending that money, the poorer people who are servicing those industries are out of work or on a furlough scheme that reimburses part of their employment. And so they've been spending their wealth. So the inequalities have got bigger. And then we've exposed the mortality in BAME communities. And what the data show on mortality from COVID-19 is that there's a social gradient. The more deprived the area, the higher the mortality, that looks roughly parallel with a social gradient from all-cause mortality. In other words, the determinants of inequalities in health more generally overlap markedly with the determinants of inequalities in COVID-19. There's a bit of a bigger excess at the bottom end because I think of overcrowding and key workers in frontline occupations being exposed to COVID-19. So what does Build Back Better look like? Number one, and Richard and I think are in total agreement, is taking a well-being approach to the economy, not saying building back better means getting back to the status quo. The status quo was not desirable before the pandemic came. That's what my 2020 report showed. It was not desirable. We needed to do things better. So this is the opportunity to do it better. And I made a whole set of specific recommendations of what that looks like. So if we put well-being at the heart of what we want to achieve, how do we get there? Well, to take the first 5 of my 6 from 2010, invest in early child development, education and lifelong learning. We know that the spending on education per pupil went down over the last 10 years. And with COVID-19, the inequalities in educational outcome will be exaggerated. It's like a prolonged summer effect, having children not in school. So we're going to have to put extra effort at redressing the inequalities in educational outcome. The third was employment and working conditions. And one thing we've learned, and please, please don't forget what we've learned, is how important to society and to all our lives are the drivers and the delivery people and the care workers and the people on the front line and the cashiers in the supermarket. We've learned how valuable they are. We don't value them in terms of pay. We just realize that our lives would collapse without them. So part of employment and working conditions is thinking about the work. Care workers. Why would we pay people a miserable wage to look after the valuable members of our society at older age? I've always made the case about early childhood that we need to have properly trained people to be involved in early child development. like in Finland, master's degrees would be a good idea. I would say we need to have people with proper job security and proper training to be care workers for people of older age, absolutely vital. The fourth was income. Everyone should have at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. And the fifth was healthy and sustainable places to live and work. And I loved everything that Dawn said. And the idea that communities are not an instrument to something else. I take the same view about health. It's not an instrument to something else. It's important in and of itself. I've probably been guilty of thinking of community as an instrument to getting better health, but I'm suitably chastised by what you said. Community is of value in and of itself, but I can predict that flourishing communities will correlate with better health. That will be a good outcome. So I think we actually know what to do. Reviewing the evidence, and I wouldn't I, but I'd push those 5 domains that I've just mentioned, because if we want to get practical about how to put well-being at the heart of building back better, then we need to invest in those 5 domains and build a better society. And then I can tell you, health will start improving again and health inequalities will diminish.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate, and to all the panelists, thank you so much for your contributions. I know that we've been receiving lots of different questions throughout the last 50 minutes or so. We've only got 7 minutes left, and then we cut off. So I'm going to try and select some of those. What we'll do is compile all the questions that have been sent to us, and we'll try and get a response out and put it on the website so that you can see the general response. And of course, we'll do our best around making sure that there's recording and all. The presentation, for example, that Daisy had earlier will also be available to everyone. But I'm going to select a couple of questions, if I may. And one has been that I thought was quite provocative, really, but and the panelists may not know the answers. But in terms of, has there been a cost-benefit analysis on well-being and prioritising that? So how are we able to demonstrate that putting well-being at the heart of the economy will have a positive impact? Who wants to have a go at that one? Just need to unmute yourself, Richard.
It's a philosophical question about what really matters most. And obviously there are many goods. There's wealth, there's freedom, etc., etc. And there's well-being. But if you ask, why does it matter if people are free, then you could say, well, they feel awful if they're not. Or if they're sick, they feel awful if they're not. But if you ask, why does it matter how people feel, you can't give an answer. That's self-evident. It matters how people feel. So well-being is the ultimate criterion for judging everything else. That's a philosophical answer. Then there's obviously the practical issue of can you apply it? And there we now have the science of well-being, where we can measure people's well-being and find out what determines it, either within nature or by experiment. And that should be the basis for determining future policy.
To unmute myself there. Would anybody else like to to respond to that? So there are sort of tools that we can use. Oh.
I mean, I would say that by putting well-being at the heart of it, the steps that you would take to achieve well-being are the steps that you would take to improve health and reduce health inequalities. So taking that philosophical approach to improving well-being will have the benefit of improving health and reducing health inequalities, which, echoing what Richard said, I think is a value that people prize. They do prize better health, not because it might lead them to get a better job, but because they value getting up in the morning and feeling healthy. It's quite a good state to have, really. And so taking those steps, putting well-being at the heart, taking the steps to achieve it will lead to better health and narrower health inequalities.
You sold me. This inequalities was why I became a politician in the first place. But if you were talking to Mr. Sunak, who will be making his financial statement, what would you be able to say in terms of the economic benefits of a well-being approach, which I think is at the heart of that particular question? I absolutely, on the philosophical perspective, but also the definite benefits to health and well-being that should be driving how we would want to respond as politicians. But from an economic perspective and answering and being able to provide evidence to HM Treasury, what evidence is there that we could say this will make a difference, having this approach? So
can I come in as neither an economist nor a politician? So this is a very lay answer, but for me it would be about the cost of not prioritising well-being. So in other words, the cost of let's call it an unhappy society. So we started with all Daisy's slides about a lot about mental health. The cost of mental health, and Louise talked about it. The employers recognise this. They recognise that actually a happy and healthy workforce actually creates happy and healthy profit if one wants to go down the instrumentalist route. So it seemed to me that actually that you could clearly, and I'm sure Nancy at the What Works Centre has done lots of work on this, actually to tease out exactly what those numbers tell you. I'm sure it exists, but since I am neither economist, academic nor politician, I don't have the data, but it seems to me that's the argument that you would employ.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Can I just, I've got several for Daisy here. I'm sorry if I'm just trying to read my notes as scribing as these questions came in. So it's from Kelsey and says, what's the evidence in relation to the relationship to mental health and compliance?
So that was something I mentioned briefly in my talk. We're actually running the analyses on that at the moment. So we are seeing a relationship, but it's going to be another week or two before we have that data properly analysed. But we'll be putting it up as a preprint on our website as soon as it is.
Thank you, Daisy. And there's a little bit of a provocative one to end on, but what was the impact in your study on the Dominic Cummings drive up to Durham? That was one that we...
I was just going to share my screen to show with you what we actually found on this. We're still looking at the mental health impact, but I'm hoping you can now see my screen on here. You will be able to now. This graph shows the trust in the government to handle the pandemic effectively. And this shows the two major drops in England that we haven't seen in Scotland or Wales. The first of these drops came just following the announcement of the early easing of lockdown in England, which we didn't see in Scotland or Wales. And as you can see, that shook people's confidence in whether the government was going to be able to handle this pandemic, although it did recover a bit in the couple of weeks following. The second drop was following the announcement about Dominic Cummings' trip up north, and the trust in government has not recovered at all since then. So whilst we're still looking at the mental health side, I think we can see very clearly that there is a relationship between what happens at the high political level and whether people believe that there's going to be effective handling of things. And of course, effective handling and confidence in government is very much linked in with compliance as well.
Thank you. We're at the bewitching hour, so it just remains for me to thank all of the panelists. Thank you everybody for attending. As I say, we will make sure that we get the questions that you posed if we haven't managed to get an answer to you yet and put that. But I'm very grateful. Daisy, Louise, Dawn, Richard, Michael, thank you everyone. And of course to everybody that has been watching today, thank you.